People who are considering sitting for a CFA exam, or maybe people who are already candidates in the CFA program, are often wondering which topics in the program are the most difficult. There is some debate here. It can be a pretty hot topic, and certainly people's opinions on which topics are the most difficult to them will differ on things like their background and how their brain works in general. Lucky for everyone who clicked on this video though, I just happen to know the perfectly accurate ranking of all the CFA topics in terms of easiest to most difficult. I'm not necessarily saying you should structure your studies around maybe starting with the easiest or the most difficult or any other combination of such, but it can be helpful to just get a little bit of insight into what you're getting into when you are queuing up to start studying for some of those more difficult topics. So let's get into it. Starting off with the easiest topic across the entire program, and lucky for you, the hopeful CFA candidate, it is in all three levels, and that's economics or econ. Another common question for people considering pursuing the CFA designation or existing CFA candidates is, hey, did your college or university studies prepare you much for the CFA exams? Or some alteration of that same question like, hey, how can I best prepare for these upcoming CFA exams? In general, my answer to that question is always no. College or university classes just aren't going to prepare you for the specific types of questions that get asked. Sure, from time to time you'll see overlap in any of the topics in the exam, but the main exception is in econ. And from my experience in probably 4 different economics classes throughout college or university, all of the topics covered and all the ideas covered in those classes, micro and macroeconomics, were very similar to the topics tested in the CFA program and actually the ways that the questions were asked. In conversations with other people who went to other universities and colleges and also studied econ in those schools, they'll tell you too that the way that they learned economics in 101, 201, 301, whatever, was also very similar to how economics was presented in the CFA curriculum. If you have any type of finance or economics background, it's really likely that you're going to find the material in this section across all 3 levels of the CFA program to be really familiar and pretty easy to grasp. The CFA exams are going to ask you a million questions about GDP, yields, inflation, things like that. They're all relatively short formulas that aren't too hard to memorize and really easy to plug the variables into to get a correct answer. It's generally straightforward stuff. You'll have a little bit on currencies here, which isn't necessarily the easiest part of the econ books, but it's not the difficult currencies questions. Those will come in level 2, derivatives and alts. The next easiest topic across the CFA exams is corporate finance. I really don't have all that much to say here. You'll find that the corporate finance sections is generally comprised of some pretty straightforward, again, 3 or 4 variable equations where you just have to memorize a couple steps and then be able to read through a item set or vignette or just a regular question and pick out which variables go where. You'll be able to get yourself to some sort of an answer. I think the material would be generally helpful if you're going into a corporate finance role. That's not the most common avenue that people use the CFA charter to pursue. So in my opinion, the Institute's pretty light on this topic. I don't remember all that much at all giving much trouble from the corporate finance section. The third easiest topic in the CFA program is equities, and it's the third easiest for many of the reasons that corporate finance was the second easiest. It's largely comprised of relatively short 3 or 4 variable equations where you just need to plug and chug some numbers from the question into your calculator to spit out an answer. They're not all that difficult to memorize. And there also are not a lot of questions where there are 5 or 6 different ways a certain question can be asked. Usually, when you see a question asked in the equities topic, you know what you're getting. You'll see a lot of stuff like CAPM model, expected return, dividend discount model. The dividend discount's like a 3 or 2 variable formula. That one's super quick and super easy, and you'll get a ton of questions about that, especially in level 1. I think this is also good news for a lot of candidates because the types of material that is covered in the equity section on both levels 1 and 2 and 3 is really relevant to the jobs that a lot of people pursue the CFA charter to try to get into, namely being equity analysts or some type of a buy-side stock analyst. We are starting to get a little bit more into the difficult test topics here though, because especially in level 2 and level 3 equities, you're going to have more complicated stuff like calculation of variances from standard deviations, covariances, correlations, I-variances, and a handful of other things that are not as straightforward as the last 2 topics that we've covered so far, but still generally one of the more manageable topics in the program. All right, with the next one, we are certainly starting to ramp it up a notch. I would no longer consider this topic a relatively easy one, or any of the future ones for that matter, but we're going to talk about alternative investments, or alts. Alts really seems to cover a bunch of random different types of investments and investment products, and different themes relative to those investment products. There's a little bit of like performance calculation, there's a little bit of risk and return calculation. It's really all over the place, and so it makes it really hard to focus in on the 5 most popular LOSs that could be tested, which is something that you could certainly do with like econ or even fixed income. So you almost don't know what you're going to get with alts. There's no cohesive flow to how the material is presented or tested or anything else with it. Otherwise, it's really random. Also in the alt section is when you're going to start to get into some of the extremely long and really ambiguous equations about like different real estate indexes and the calculations of their price levels in the different indexes. There'll be like 4 indexes that are all almost the same thing, but they have these minute differences. And you have to remember a really long stringed out equation where for each of the 4 different indexes in calculating real estate prices, sometimes the 4th and the 7th variable is changed for this one, and then for the 3rd one you got to change the 1st and the 10th variable, and all just like little minutia things that are really hard to get right, especially under the pressure of test day. I've never talked about this in a video before because I really can't get specific here because of the ethics requirements, but my most memorable moment or part of the CFA program came during my level 2 exam on a question in the alts section, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I really wish I could share more about this story, but I just can't. I'm just going to leave it at the fact that alts is the 4th least difficult topic to test, but it is pretty tough. Number 5 is ethics, and this is a weird one. I was really torn in deciding where this one should be ranked because it is the one that is the most different, in my opinion, based on the material that you study versus the material that you'll be tested on. Remember that all 3 levels test on ethics, but they all draw from the same information. You're getting tested on the same ethics book all 3 times, and similar questions can be asked. Now, it's not easy, but it's manageable to run through the blue boxes and end of chapter questions and all practice questions from your third-party test prep provider and become really confident with every ethical standard. You can know the ins and outs of them. You can answer every blue box and every EOC correctly because you're going to see very similar blue boxes and EOCs across all 3 levels because, again, the material doesn't change. And that makes ethics very unique because the institute can't just test on the same exact stuff all 3 years. It would make it too easy for a lot of candidates to score 80, 90, or 100% of the questions right on exam day. So even though studying for ethics becomes easy, the questions that they ask you in the ethics topics on the exams are not that. And in the CFA Institute's defense, again, they have to make these confusing. They have to test you on the gray areas because the black and white just gets too straightforward. You've been studying all that black and white stuff for the past 3, 4, 5 years. You're going to have 90% of it down. They can't just keep testing you on all that. So they have to make it really tricky, really ambiguous, really tough, and that's exactly what they do. So it's like a 1 in terms of difficulty when you study, at least throughout the level 3 program, because you're familiar from the last 2 years, but it's like a 10 on the exams. And so I guess I have to put it somewhere in the middle. Number 6 is portfolio management. Now we're into the more difficult half of the program. This is my personal favorite topic. It's most relevant to the job I was kind of already doing at the time and really want to be doing and am still doing now. It's difficult mostly because on level 3, it's kind of like 100% of the exam. I mean, they write it down as 40 to 50%, but every single other topic that's tested in level 3, they'll ask you questions from that topic through the lens of a portfolio manager. So the entire L3 exam is kind of portfolio management, and so you really have to have it down pat, which is why I'm ranking it relatively difficult here now. The content for the level 1 and 2 exams in PM isn't really that tough. There's a lot of risk and return measurement stuff, performance measurement, things I think are generally cool, but again, because of how important it becomes on the level 3 exam, which is ultimately how you might become a CFA charter holder, this one becomes relatively difficult, and you certainly want to kind of master it. Next is fixed income, and they shouldn't be as hard as they are, but for whatever reason, you just can't get these right all the time. There's just going to be some curveballs in the way that certain calculations get handled in the fixed income section where you'll have a question and you'll know like 3 or 4 equations that could potentially get you to the answer, and they're all very similar, and it's just really hard to differentiate between them and do all the math right to get to the number that you need. It's also a pretty boring section. I think 90% of candidates and charter holders would tell you they didn't love studying for fixed income. There are a couple highlights in there. Level 2, I really like doing binomial interest rate trees. It's kind of like a Sudoku puzzle. But point is, when you're bored, it's harder to study for. It's harder to perform well on the exam in this section. Just a lot of minutia, a lot of math, and not a super fun one. Some people might tell you it's the most difficult section. Most people are not right, but it's certainly up there. Okay, now we're getting into the 3 most difficult topics in the CFA program. Number 8 is going to be quantitative methods, also known as quant, which is basically statistics. Now, there's a real similarity here between quant and economics, which is that the quant section is very similar to what you will have seen in college or university statistics classes. And you might be saying, but AJ, you said that econ was easy in the CFA program because it's similar to what you tested on in college. Why isn't quant the same way? Well, it's not the same way for a couple reasons. Number one is it's just more difficult than any statistics classes I saw in college and university. You're just going to have much longer types of equations that you have to solve, unfortunately. But also, in those classes, you're just focused on this. Again, with the CFA program, you're focused on 9 other topics as well. So it's really hard to become a master in quant and do really well in a quant exam. Whereas, again, in like university, you're just doing one final exam, probably that day, maybe 2 finals in one day. But you have a lot more time to just prepare for statistics. Whereas with this, you have a lot of other things going on. Maybe that's a bad excuse. I know that's true for every other topic in the program, but quant in particular has the most math, the most long formula memorization behind it than any other topic, and it makes it extremely difficult. The next one, if you say this one is the most difficult topic in the CFA program, you're wrong. You're pretty close, but you're wrong. This one is going to be FRA, Financial Reporting and Analysis, which is basically corporate accounting. There is so much minutia in FRA that you have to stuff into your brain that it just becomes absolutely ridiculous. It's similar to the minutia I've complained about in other sections or topics from the CFA program, but it's just so much more pronounced in this section. Having to memorize things about certain business transactions and which method you'd use to recognize certain things, like a cash flow method, an investing method. I don't even ever remember. There's a lot of different types of methods to do these things. And then you have to memorize all those for US GAAP and IFRS and determine, based on the question, which method and which accounting standard you have to use for that scenario, and then do all the math right, make all the right deductions, pull certain line items from income statements and balance sheets, plug them into the right spots on the equations, and the equations sometimes are not very clear about what goes where. It is just an unbelievable amount of minutia. Looking back at it, I can't believe that I was able to, not in bragging, but there's just so much crap. I don't know how any human being, and hats off to every CFA charter holder out there or anyone who's passed even level 1 exam in the FRA section, because it's just so annoying. It's kind of cool stuff, to be honest. Once you know it all, once you can really roll through it, it feels good. And it really tells you a lot about how finances work, how companies and how stocks are valued. I think it's probably the most valuable section, at least in like college and university studies, and also maybe in the CFA program. But goodness, it is so difficult. And there are so many little details to memorize and get right that it's a tough section for sure. Number 10, the single most difficult topic across the entire CFA program is derivatives. I have 2 things to say about derivatives, and then I'm going to stop talking about it because I just don't want to think about it. The math involved in a lot of the derivatives type problems, and especially in currency swaps and Forex valuations on the level 2 exam, is the most difficult math and the most difficult academic challenge I've ever faced in my entire life. It was the one section of the program that I truly never got a good understanding of. I certainly couldn't have answered a detailed foreign currency swap valuation question right on any of the exams. Some of those questions are literally just impossible in my opinion. I don't think anyone probably gets them right consistently. The institute has to see that, only 4% of candidates got these questions right. Something must be wrong here. I just don't get it. Derivatives is an absolute nightmare. The other point I want to make about it is that everything you learn in that derivatives topic, and the whole book, I should say, is totally useless. You're never going to do any of this stuff in the real world. All of it's going to be calculated for you on a Bloomberg terminal, or you're going to see Forex rates already quoted, and all these types of random things that you have to do to answer those questions correctly are already going to be done for you by computers. It is such useless information, and knowing that while you're studying it, grinding through these grueling nights of extremely tough questions that you need to somehow figure out how to do to score enough right to pass the test, but you just hate doing, it's probably the most difficult thing I think I've ever done. And there you have it, everyone. Let me know in the comments down below if you think I'm spot on with these or if you disagree. As always, thanks for watching. I really appreciate the support on the videos here. If you could also like this video and subscribe to the channel, both of those things help me out. I have a few links in the description down below to some other third parties that you can support me on too. As always, thanks for watching.